Good evening. Welcome to our January Veritas lecture. For those I haven't met, I'm Pastor Bordelin, one of the pastors here. We're just really blessed this evening to have with us Pastor John Bauer, 2008 graduate from our seminary, and for the last 10 plus years has served as a mission pastor in Mount Horeb, Wisconsin. Very gifted speaker, speaks around our church body on different topics, including the one you're going to hear this evening. Just a reminder, this will be streamed live and the recording made available on YouTube. So if you ask any questions, just know thousands of people are going to hear that. No, I share that with you so you can share tonight's lecture with others as you wish. Pastor Bauer is going to go till about 7:25 or so, and then we'll call time out, and if you want to leave, you're certainly free to do so. Then at 7:30, we'll begin our half-hour monthly prayer at the close of day service. Advertisement for next month, February 5th, Pastor Wayne Olhorn, our mission counselor, will be here to talk about mission trends and opportunities that we would have in our own backyard to do mission work and think about those close to us who don't have the hope that we have in Christ. So, Pastor Bauer, let's welcome him to St. John's. Thank you.
John? All right. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here with you tonight. I have to ask, does he say that bit about the gifted speaker thing with everybody that comes? No, he doesn't? Okay. I was going to ask if that's ever proven not to be true, because maybe I could be the first one tonight. But no, thank you for that introduction, Pastor Bordelin. It is great to be here with you this evening and to share what I have about this, what I think is a very important topic, the topic of anthropology, which we'll talk about what exactly that means in just a second. But just a little bit more introduction, just so you've got a little bit of background on me. First of all, there's a picture of my family up there. So I am married to a wonderful woman named Lindsay. We've got 3 kids. Noah is a senior at Luther Prep. Addison, the one kind of front and center, is an 8th grader this year, and then our youngest, Corinne, is a 6th grader. So I serve a church over in Mount Horeb, which is just on the other side of Madison. Who's been to Mount Horeb before? Oh, look at that, a decent number. Very good. So usually when I'm telling people about Mount Horeb, I introduce it by its biggest claim to fame, I would say, which is that it is the troll capital of the world. And I'm guessing if you have been to Mount Horeb, you probably know that. But I feel like tonight, I should mention, because I think there's some commonality here, that Mount Horeb for quite a while was also known as the one town, at least in that area, that had roundabouts. So going all the way back, probably 10, 15 years, all of a sudden Mount Horeb put in like 4 roundabouts, and it was actually part of, I think, like a DOT experiment to see how these things work. And nowhere else in Wisconsin had roundabouts yet. And so as I drove down 83 tonight on my way into McGuanago and went through all those roundabouts one after the other, I said, these are my people. We understand each other because we know how the roundabouts work. So anyways, I serve at a church called Good News. The church was started about, I guess it's been 11 years now. At that point, the kind of coming out of Madison, the last outpost of Wellsdom, we might say, was in Verona, which is just right on the edge of Madison. And so in the early 2010s, the church in Verona wanted to branch out and expand and reach into a new community, and Mount Horeb was the one that they picked. And so the church got started in 2013. I arrived in 2014. We spent some time in a couple of different rented spaces as we were getting up and running. Now we just celebrated, I guess, our 2-year anniversary in our first permanent official building. And so God has blessed the efforts there, and it's been a wonderful privilege to serve as the pastor at Good News. Second of all, just a little bit about this presentation. So I think in a lot of ways I've had the opportunity to learn a few things sort of with on-the-job training, you might say, about this topic of anthropology, both in terms of the place that I serve and as a result of this big shared experience that we had a couple years back called the COVID-19 pandemic, and some of the things that I think that taught us about anthropology. But actually I was asked to write a more extended essay on the topic about a year ago. So there was a conference down in the Atlanta, Georgia area that was related to the topic of anthropology, and specifically how that intersects with the use of technology within the church. And so this was down at a church in Atlanta, and I wrote an essay for that. If I remember correctly, I think I had 2.5 hours of agenda time to deliver that essay. And so it's quite lengthy compared to what we're going to go through tonight. But if you are at all interested, there is a link right at the top of your handout. If you go to that website, goodnewslc.org/anthropology, I think I've got it set up correctly. It should take you to a page where there's just 2 links. One is a link to the essay I wrote a year ago. The other is a link to the slides from the presentation tonight. So if you're at all interested in reading more, you can go there. All right, so with that, why don't we dive in? And probably the place to start is to say, why are we talking about anthropology, and what is anthropology even in the first place? So you look at that word, I've got it on in the introduction, anthropology. Can anyone fill in the blanks? Do you know what should go there? Anthropology is the what of what? Good. You're close. You're right on track there. So when you hear that ending ology, really in any word, think the study of. So instead of history, I've got the study of. So ology, the study of, and then that anthro at the beginning, that refers to human beings. So anthropology is the study of human beings, which then leads to the question, well, why is that important for us to study as Christians? Maybe when you hear that term anthropology, you think of some class that you saw in a course catalog in college or something like that. But what in the world does that have to do with us, and why is it so important? Just a couple of reasons why you might find the topic important tonight. So at the heart of some of the things that are going on in our world today, I think are issues related to anthropology. So for example, kind of the ongoing discussion and ever-evolving discussion about what exactly human gender is and how a person's biological sex intersects with that concept of human gender is something that very much has to do with the topic of anthropology. So recently that debate, at least in part, has focused on the idea of biological men competing in sports that are typically reserved for biological women. So going all the way back a couple of years, we had Leah Thomas swimming competitively. More recently, you maybe heard about the player on the San Jose State volleyball team. That was just this fall. Again, a biological man who's playing with females. Maybe it caught your attention just in this past election that the whole topic of gender and transgenderism kind of played a role in the election. I think I heard that an ad or a series of ads that maybe you saw were the ads that the Trump campaign spent the most money on. And there were a series of them, but they all ended the same way, where it would say something like, Kamala stands with they, them, Trump stands with you. And so kind of playing off of that issue of how do we define gender, what should we make of the transgender topic and issue, played an important role in our recent election. And I would say anthropology is at the heart of that. Shifting gears a little bit, we might think about technology and some of the crazy advances in technology that are happening and leading us to ask questions of how does this intersect with who we are as human beings. So can a robot replace a nurse or a caregiver and take care of patients in a nursing home? If we're having a shortage of workers, can a robot do the job? Or maybe we would think in terms of ChatGPT and OpenAI. Maybe you've heard that the actress Scarlett Johansson is involved, or maybe was involved, I don't know if it's over by now, in a lawsuit against OpenAI because they make use of a voice in their technology that sounds an awful lot like hers. And so she's basically accusing them of regenerating her voice with AI technology to make people think as though they're kind of listening to Scarlett Johansson. And what in the world are we supposed to make of that? I would say anthropology has a lot to do with how we're going to answer that question. Maybe we would also take it into the church and think of a couple of examples there. I saw a story recently over on the left there. There was a church over in Switzerland that did a little experiment with an AI Jesus. And so the idea is that you could go into that church, and instead of going to confession to talk to a priest, you'd go to confession and there'd be an avatar of Jesus, and you would just be chatting back and forth with this this completely AI-produced image and voice and responses from Jesus. Just to be fair, that it was an experiment. So they weren't saying, hey, this is the next big thing and this is wonderful. They were just trying to see, first of all, how people would react, how people would respond to the idea of going to talk to a robot, basically, and then secondly, how effective it was. Or even something which seems a lot less extreme, just the idea of somebody, rather than coming to a place like this on a Sunday morning, instead just putting their feet up on the couch and watching church from home. Churches like this one putting stuff out there on the internet so people all over the world can watch it, and maybe lots and lots of Christians thinking, hey, watching right from the comfort of my own home is just as good as going there to be there in person. Again, I think anthropology has a lot to say about that. So hopefully that whets your appetite a little bit about some of the things that I think are going to be addressed as we go through this tonight. Okay? Just to kind of reinforce that a little bit, I've got two quotations there, really coming from completely opposite perspectives, in the sense that the first one is from a guy named Ray Kurzweil. He is not at all a Christian or really all that favorably disposed toward Christianity, but he's very much into technology and envisioning what our future is going to be like. And it is his opinion that the biggest question that we really need to come to grips with and answer is, what exactly is a human being? The question that anthropology answers. The bottom one there is by a guy named Carl Trueman. He very much is a Christian, and a pretty conservative Christian, we might say, and he basically says the same thing, that just as different ages of the church's history have had to wrestle with other questions of primary importance, his opinion is that in our day, the question of anthropology, what exactly is a human being, is really the one that matters most. All right, so as we begin, I want to kind of introduce a concept that I think is almost like this lens or this filter that hopefully guides the way that we approach looking at some of the things that we're going to be talking about tonight, and coming at it from the perspective of this biblical doctrine of anthropology. So you see a map up there that illustrates what I think is kind of an interesting geographical phenomenon in our country. So start with the 3 yellow stars. You got one that's way up in the north in Canada, right at a little river that goes into the Hudson Bay. Then you've got another one over to the east that is right at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River that kind of opens up into the wider St. Lawrence Seaway that leads out to the Atlantic Ocean. And then you've got one way down at the bottom that's at the mouth of the Mississippi River in New Orleans, Louisiana. So if you were standing in one of those 3 places, it would seem to you that you are miles and miles away. You are far, far away from the other 2, right? Those 3 destinations are miles and miles apart. And yet it is the case that the water that ends up in each of those 3 places might have started at exactly the same spot. So there is a little place right in kind of central northern Minnesota, right near a town called Hibbing. Never been there myself, but it's called the Hill of 3 Waters. You can see there's a plaque over there on the right. And from this one spot, there is what's called like a threefold or a 3-way continental divide. So from this one spot, water can go in any one of those 3 directions. And so even though it ends up in places that are very, very far away from each other, it all starts in exactly the same spot. And that's kind of the picture I want you to think about as we talk about some of the things that are going on in our world. We might look at specific things that get said, specific words that get used, specific behaviors that people get caught up in, and they might seem miles and miles and miles away from anything that resembles sort of a traditional way of looking at things or a biblical way of looking at things. We might look at 2 different behaviors that seem like night and day difference, and yet what I'm hoping to illustrate tonight is that very often those 2 seemingly different behaviors can originate from the same source. And so rather than just looking at kind of the end result and saying, well, what are we supposed to think about this and this and this and this, all these end results sort of things, let's go all the way back upstream, let's go all the way back up to the source, and let's see where the true split, the true division takes place. Maybe you remember learning in social studies class at some point that if water is truly going to flow in an opposite direction on our continent, then it needs to be located not in Hibbing, Minnesota, where it can go in those 3 different places, but on the other side of what's called the Continental Divide, right, which is way out west in the Rocky Mountains, and then it actually goes somewhere that's completely different. So we want to go all the way back to that source and say, okay, if this is the direction God wanted humanity to go and wanted humanity to think about itself and act and behave, where does that first get off course and go in a completely different direction? So that's where we're going to start tonight. So with that, there's probably no better place to start than the book of Genesis itself. So if you look at your handout, what comes next is I'm going to talk about 4 of these anthropological divides. So just like our continent has a divide that sends the water in 2 different directions, I'm going to talk about 4 different ways that God kind of set human beings on one specific course, but human beings have decided to go on a different course instead. So if you are a fill-in-the-blank kind of person, here's the first one. The divide between icons and originals. So how are we supposed to view ourselves as human beings? I'm going to make the case that we should view ourselves as icons, but instead what human beings have decided to do is to view themselves as originals. So let's see where this divide takes place. Going all the way back to the beginning, verses that might be familiar to you, God said when he created human beings, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. So that's kind of where he says what he's going to do, and then he does it. God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. This concept that God created us in his image, again, probably nothing new to you, but what exactly is that saying? It's saying that as human beings, we are to be what we might call icons. In fact, that's kind of the Greek word that gets used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament is the word that would sound like icon. We are meant to be reflections of God. In other words, when he created us, it wasn't like this brand new thing that he made up. Instead, there's like a prior reference that we are supposed to be reflections of. Okay, so we're supposed to mirror the God who created us, not in every respect. We're not like God in every way, but we were intended to be like God in some ways. But what course did humanity decide to go down instead? Instead, they decided to listen to the lie of the devil where he said, you can be like God. So not reflections of God, not icons of God, but you can be your own truly one-of-a-kind original God just like God is. You can be like God knowing both good and evil. So how does that show up in our world today? Just a couple of examples here. Whether you're talking to somebody who maybe is working with this biblical phrase of human beings created in the image of God, or maybe it's more of a secular thing that takes the shape of saying something like that all human beings have a certain human dignity to them or a certain worth to them. In either case, I think sorting through these 2 different options, are we talking about humans being icons or humans being originals, is kind of important. So up on the screen, I've got 2 pictures. You recognize the one on the left, that's the Mona Lisa. The other one on the right, I want you to think of 1,000 bars of gold. Okay, so the Mona Lisa and 1,000 bars of gold. Both of those 2 things, if we had them here side by side, are worth approximately the same amount. So they're both worth about $800 million. So as far as their value goes, they're equal, and yet their value is very different in its nature and its essence, what it's based on, in other words. So let's say the Louvre were to donate to you, they just wanted to give you the gift of the Mona Lisa. There you go, it's $800 million. If you were to take that painting and you were to smash the frame, and then you were to take a nice sharp scissors and you were to cut right down the middle of the canvas, some of you are cringing a little bit, how much is that painting going to be worth at that point? Absolutely nothing, right? You've ruined it. It's meant to be a depiction of something, and as soon as you ruin the depiction, you've ruined its worth, you've ruined its value, right? But if you had 1,000 bars of gold, let's say they were all stacked up nice and neatly in those nice rectangular bars, and you took that gold and you melted it down. And then once it was melted down, you refashioned it into a completely different shape. In fact, maybe the shape that you fashioned it into was something that we would consider pretty ugly, maybe even a shape that's downright grotesque. Even after you fashion that gold into a different shape, how much is that gold going to be worth? It's going to be worth $800 million nonetheless, right? So the one on the left, I think what I'm trying to say is that's what represents God's direction for what gives human beings their uniqueness and their value, that he created us to be icons of him, to be reflections of him. And as soon as that gets ruined, then we're no longer the thing that God created us to be. The world's image of what gives human beings value and worth is more the one on the right. The impression is almost that we're made of this special, precious stuff, and no matter what we do, no matter what shape we take, no matter what path we pursue with our lives, we all have this universal human dignity or universal human value, and it stays the same no matter what. Okay, so icon versus the original. And one of the ways that this kind of shows up is with the very common expression, you do you, right? Your job, your goal as a human being is just to be yourself, because you are this truly original, wonderful, special thing. One of the other areas that it shows up in our world is basically with every Disney princess movie that's been made in the last 20 years, right? This is kind of the plot line of the entire thing, that there's something inside that someone needs to discover, they need to come to grips with, and then they need to let it out. They need to live according to it. All right, so that's icons versus originals. The next one. Some of these are very much related, by the way, and there's definitely a good amount of overlap between the two. So human beings as creatures who are named versus human beings as creatures who are naming. So named versus naming. And again, let's go back to the beginning. So in Genesis, it says that when God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God, and he named them mankind when they were created. So who determines, who actually uses the words that describes the truth about mankind? Well, God does. But we also hear that when God created mankind, he didn't just create one of them, he created two of them. And when he created Eve, he said, I'm going to make a helper suitable for him. Now, maybe when we hear that verse, we first and foremost think of the work that Adam and Eve are going to do together, and we'll get to that in just a second. But for now, what we really want to focus on is that God is saying, I'm going to make this second human being, this woman, as someone who is facing Adam. That's kind of what's literally there in the Hebrew a little bit underneath the English translation. So somebody that Adam looks at face to face. And then we learn a little bit about what the blessing of that is, that when you are looking at another human being face to face, you learn something. Well, they first of all learn something about you when they look at you, and then in their words, when they describe what they see, you learn something very important about yourself. So when Eve wakes up from her sleep, what does Adam say? He says, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. So Eve learns something about who she is because she has one who is facing her, who has told her the truth about herself. In either case, whether we're talking about God doing the naming directly or another human being communicating that to somebody, the point is, I don't just declare for myself who I am and what is the truth about me. But of course, that's what human beings these days want to do. And again, it goes all the way back to the garden. So when Adam and Eve first sinned, it says the eyes of both of them were opened and they realized they were naked. Where do they look immediately? Once they fall into sin. God created them to be face to face, to be looking at each other. Where do they look instantly once they've sinned? They look at themselves, right? They realize both of them are naked, and then how do they respond? They sew fig leaves together and make coverings for themselves. So I'm in charge now of revealing myself, disclosing myself to others according to my own terms. If there's something I don't want other people to see, I'm going to put a covering over it. I'm going to hide it. They did that not only kind of in relationship with each other, but then with God as well. It's where God tracks him down in the garden. Adam says, I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. I don't want God to see me, and so I'm going to take charge of revealing the truth about myself. I'm going to hide from God, and I'll only reveal myself on my own terms. One of the ways that this shows up, our culture is obsessed with authenticity. So again, it starts with this inward look, and once I come to some sort of notion of who I am on the inside, then it's my job to communicate that to the rest of the world and to live that out in a way that corresponds with what's inside of me. That authenticity includes anonymity, big thing in our world that we very much make it part of what everyone should expect to be able to do that. If there's something I want to keep hidden from the rest of the world, then I've got the right to be able to do that. A phrase like be true to yourself comes into play as well. And of course, all of this is facilitated by what some people have referred to as the digital fig leaves of our day, that with those little devices, we can both reveal everything that we want to reveal. We can share with others everything that we want to share, and then we can also keep hidden, or we can filter out, or we can hide, or we can keep private everything that we want to keep private. So again, we're in charge. No one else is going to be the authority on us. Instead, we're the authority on ourselves. So, icons versus originals, and named versus naming. Limited versus liberated is our next one. So when God created human beings, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over. So we started with that passage already, but now there's a little bit more added. God created human beings in his image, and the fact that he created them that way was so that they could carry out a specific purpose. God himself is invisible, right? He's a spirit. He's a non-physical entity. But now he had created this entire universe, including planet Earth, that was a physical, visible place. And so in order for it to be cared for, in order for it to be managed, he had to create icons of him that had a physical form. In other words, these first two creatures, they had bodies, right? And we know that from Genesis 2, verse 7 as well, that God formed them out of the dust of the ground, that he took a rib from Adam's side to make Eve, okay? So they're not just images of God, they are images of God. They're visible, physical reflections of him so that they can care for his world. Well, how are two people supposed to care for the entire world? They're well, our world might say confined to their human body. They're confined to one specific place. God had a plan for that as well. Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. And again, he connects it to his commands so that they can rule over. So it's not my job to do absolutely everything. It wasn't Adam and Eve's job to care for all of God's creation. They were limited. But God gave them the ability to multiply and to fill the earth so that all of them as limited individuals together could carry out God's command. Of course, our limitation only gets enhanced by the fall into sin. God says to Adam, by the sweat of your brow, you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you will return. So now we also have a limited lifespan, right? Because we're going to die. And as we carry out the task that God has given us of caring for his world, it's not always going to go the way that we want it to go. We're going to experience frustration and toil. The world is no longer the perfect home that God created for human beings. Instead, it's full of all kinds of dangers and diseases. And in all of these ways, human beings are limited creatures. They were not created by God to do absolutely everything, okay? But that didn't stop them from maybe wanting to. So in the wake of the fall into sin, you know the story, God boots them from the garden, and the specific reason he boots them from the garden is so that they would not attempt to become unlimited again, right? So that they wouldn't eat from the tree of life and attempt to become immortal. If we fast forward a little bit, we get another glimpse of human beings' desires to be liberated from their limitedness at the Tower of Babel. This is what the people who built the Tower of Babel said. Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens. We can go as high as imaginable, right? We can extend beyond this place where God has put us, so that we can make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. God wanted us to multiply and spread out and fill the earth, but we're from right here in this one place, we're going to build a tower that reaches up to the heavens, and we're going to stay right here. Okay, so God created human beings with all kinds of natural limitations. He gave us bodies that limit us. He put us in specific places that limit us. We can't be everywhere all at once, but human beings want to be naturally liberated from those limitations and to be able to go everywhere, to do everything, even to maximize and even extend forever the limited amount of time that God has given us. So how does this show up? Expressions like, you can do anything that you set your mind to, which of course is ridiculous, right? Nobody can do anything that they set their mind to. Back in 1930, there was a very famous economist. I want to get his name here. John Maynard Keynes was the name of the guy. In 1930, he saw technological advances coming, and he wanted to make a bold prediction. He said, in 100 years, we're going to have so much technology that does all of our work for us that people will only need to work 15 hours a week. So we've got 5 years left to get there, right? Do you think we're going to do it? Do you think in 5 years technology is going to advance and we're just going to say, hey, that's it, we're content. Look at everything that's getting done. This is wonderful. We can just sit back and relax, right? No matter how much we are getting done, human beings always want to do more. We want to extend beyond the natural limits that God has created us with. Even when we rest, the idea that we would take a break, we would rest as God has commanded us to do, but we would connect that only with the ability to be able to do more work. And so we say things like, well, I need to recharge my batteries, right? I wish I could work all the time, but eventually I get worn down a little bit, so I'm going to take some rest, but it's only so that I can do more, right? We want to be liberated from the limits that God has set for us. Okay, last one is that God created human beings to be dependent on one another, to be mutually dependent and reliant on each other, but we want to be autonomous. We want to belong to no one but ourselves. So I talked about that a little bit with the verse that's on the top already. God said, I will make a helper suitable for him. God wants human beings to care for all of his creation, but he didn't just create one of them. He didn't even just duplicate one after the other. Instead, he made someone who was different. And because they were different from each other, it meant they both were dependent on each other, right? Men bring something to our world that women don't, and women bring something to our world that men don't. Male and female, he created them, right? You can't take one out of the equation and the other will be just fine on their own, right? So we're mutually dependent on each other, but already in the wake of the fall into sin, notice what Adam is expressing. That woman that you put here with me, God, I would have been fine just by myself, right? I don't need anybody to help me, but that woman that you put here with me, look at the mess that she's made, look at what she has caused. So a couple ways where this shows up. Kind of interesting thing in our world today that you take a word like belong, and I don't know if you have ever thought about this, but when we say I belong in a place or you belong in a place, we're really using that word almost in the exact opposite meaning of the basic definition of the word. So the word belong means that something is under your ownership, right? So if this computer belongs to me, it means it's mine. These papers belong to me. They're mine, right? I am the owner of them. But when someone says, okay, here's a place that I feel like I belong, really what they are saying is kind of tracing our way back from the beginning, that once I have looked deep inside and figure out what makes me so unique and so special, and then I have declared that, I've named myself instead of being named by others, now I am expecting the rest of you to let me into your group, right? To assure me that I fit in. And so in that case, who really belongs to whom? It's really all of you that belong to me. And yet I'm saying I belong as if you are the owners, we might say, of me, but in reality, I've kind of set up the circumstances so that you're beholden to me. Or if it's flipped vice versa, if a group says, oh, you belong here, you're essentially saying, we've put ourselves at your disposal, we've agreed to your terms, and so yes, you can belong to the group. So instead of this mutual dependence, I want to be part of this group, and so I have to figure out what obligations I have to them. I expect all of you to have an obligation to me to just kind of open your arms and welcome me in, right? So instead of being autonomous, or instead of being dependent on others, we want to be autonomous. We want to be ourselves, and we want everyone else to accept us just the way we are. All right, so there's our 4. Icons versus originals, named versus naming, limited versus liberated, and dependent versus autonomous. All right, back to our concept here, our little lens for looking at things, okay? So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to explore what do we find downstream? So I'm going to go through a couple of different examples here, and I'm going to show a list of things that maybe in some ways, again, seem outwardly miles and miles apart, very, very different from one another. But hopefully we can see, if we go back upstream, we see some of the same logic, some of the same assumptions, some of the same ways of thinking at work. And so instead of just looking at those kind of end results and the outward behaviors and saying, well, this one is right and this one is wrong, let's go back upstream and see if the logic that's at the heart of them is the way that God wanted us to be or the way that we wanted to be instead. So we'll maybe jump around here a little bit. Let's start with this one. So when it comes to the topic of romance, I'm going to find someone to spend my life with. A very common phrase and even ideas that go with it, the idea that you complete me. So I found someone about whom I would say, you complete me, and maybe when you hear that phrase, you think of where it kind of first became real famous in the movie Jerry Maguire, right? So you complete me. The idea that getting married to someone is kind of the final step in this long romantic quest where you are looking for the person that really helps you be the person that you've decided to be, right? You complete me. And if we picture, a young, decent-looking actor and a young, decent-looking actress saying this about each other, we might look at the outward circumstances of that and say, well, there's nothing wrong or bad about that. That seems totally fine and totally normal. But of course, in our day and age, the you that's being talked about there as the choice at the end of someone's romantic quest might be somebody very different, right? Or it might even take this form. Well, you complete me, but at some point in the future, you might not complete me. And so if really the goal is for me to be authentic and true to myself and live out the life that I figured out is inside of me, then as soon as you no longer fit into that picture, then we're going to go our separate ways, right? So we can justify marriages that aren't going to last till death do us part. You complete me for now. Or even, getting a little bit more radical, you complete me, right? Again, if really the starting point is I'm defining myself, I'm naming myself, then if one or two or three people help out with that, then on what basis can we really say, hey, that shouldn't be allowed, right? So even though the behaviors might look very, very different, just this idea that finding a spouse is about finding your soulmate or finding the person who helps you maximize the satisfaction and fulfillment that you experience in life, it really is all based on kind of some of those same assumptions, even if the paths end up in very different places. All right. Let's see if I can get maybe a little bit more provocative here. So, let's say you were to get an email from me. And at the bottom in my little form template email signature, it said, this is from Pastor Jonathan Bauer. And then I put my preferred pronouns in there and signed it Good News Lutheran Church. Maybe you'd find that a little bit strange, a little bit peculiar, a little bit surprising. Maybe you'd even think, well, that's not right? I kind of know what I'm supposed to think about when somebody does that, and I wouldn't expect a Lutheran pastor to be doing something like that. But what if you got an email from me that had my signature at the bottom, and then after my name and the church that I'm at, it said things like intellection, achiever, input, learner, focus. Who knows what those words are? Go ahead. Okay, those are my 5 Clifton strengths, and those actually are my top 5 Clifton strengths, right? So you'd see that and you think, well, that's totally normal. I see that all the time. I see that in my workplace. Maybe I've even seen that from pastors before. But again, you kind of go back upstream and you think to yourself, boy, there's a lot of the same logic at work in both of those. It first starts with, again, me kind of internally figuring out who am I, and then second of all, assuming that the very first thing I need to do is I need to let everybody know what that is, right? So even if this is the first email that you've ever received from me, and maybe we've never even interacted in person, right off the bat, I am going to tell you the truth about me. My assumption is that there's something about me that you need to know. Instead of maybe realizing, boy, here's this new person that I've never met before, we're going to get to know each other, this might be the start of a working relationship with one another, and I might learn something about myself based on what they say about me, what their reaction to me is. So instead of me naming myself, maybe I have something to learn from these new people that I'm meeting. So again, the paths maybe seem very, very different from each other, but there's a lot of the same logic way back at the top. All right, let's see. Boy, time is flying here. Let's get into a little bit more church life here. Ooh. Oh, let's see. How about this one? This is a fairly simple one. So nothing new. Netflix has been around for a long time. Really, the premise of Netflix and everything that goes along with it is the idea that you should be able to watch whatever you want to watch on your own terms, right? Your own time, your own setting, wherever you want to be, whenever you want it to be, right? Netflix was kind of the death of appointment TV. The idea that if we want to watch this new episode of this show that came out, we've all got to get together in the same place at the same time, because really, it's your life. You're the one in charge. You should be able to do it at your own time and on your own terms. And then, of course, we see the same thing spilling over into the life of the church, right? And even some of the same logic being used to justify it. Why is it so great that we can put our services online? Well, it's so that people can watch when they want to watch, right? That they aren't limited or dependent on what other people are doing, but that instead they can be captains of their own ship. They can manage their schedules however they want. They can maybe even do some things while they're watching TV, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And in that way, they kind of can extend or expand beyond the limitations of what happens when you come here in person, and there's really nothing else you can be getting done while you're sitting here in church, right? It's kind of the one thing you have to be focused on. But if you can just watch at home, you can fold laundry at the same time, and isn't that nice? Let's see. Let's do one more here related to church life. All right, so who remembers when Starbucks first got really, really big? I don't know if it was ever an official slogan that they had, or if it was just something that they talked about, but there was this idea that they had for what made Starbucks such a great place to go and get coffee. The idea was that Starbucks was supposed to be a third space. Do you remember that at all? So first space is home, second space is work. This third space is this wonderful place where people can gather together, where they can be together, where they can enjoy coffee and conversation. That was the whole model behind the Starbucks franchise. But eventually they caved to just the necessities of trying to sell more coffee, and so pretty soon more and more Starbucks had drive-through. And so now I can get my coffee, and I don't have to have any relationship whatsoever with the other people who are getting coffee, because instead of going in there together, we all go through separately through the drive-through. We've taken this even to a new extreme in our day, where we don't even have to go through the drive-through. Instead, we just get the drive-through to come to us. And with things like Uber Eats and DoorDash, we get our food brought to us. So the idea is taking something, enjoying some food, enjoying some beverage, something that sort of inherently brings us together with other people, and dissecting that and making that more of an individual thing, so that instead of all coming together, I can just do that by myself. I can get either the calories or the caffeine that I need, and that's really, really what it's all about. And one area where maybe we've seen this creep into the church a little bit as well is when it comes to Holy Communion. I think I can certainly speak for the pastors in the room of saying we've dealt with plenty of times where if people, regardless of their religious background, they want to come to the Lord's table at a church like this, they might say something like, "Well, this is just between me and God," right? So it has nothing to do with your church. It has nothing to do with the other people who are believers at this church. This is just between me and God. And we're very good at saying, no, it actually does have something to do with the rest of the people here, because when you receive communion, you're making a confession of your faith, and you're saying something about what you believe. And yet that very same logic, I think, was real easy to creep in to a lot of people's minds when all of a sudden we weren't gathering together, or maybe it was a little bit risky for us to gather together. And so right away I think, well, just like I can go to the drive-thru to get my coffee, or I can get it brought to me, or I can go to the drive-thru to get my food or get it brought to me, so maybe I don't need to be around anybody else when I have this special meal called Holy Communion. And so rather than being dependent, I can be autonomous, and I can just receive that on my own terms, on my own time, whether that's, again, watching a service online and then having communion in my house, or maybe even just leading my own family in communion all by ourselves, whatever it might be, just that tendency to divorce ourselves from the community of believers that God has made us a part of. So again, very different behaviors, but I think some of the same logic behind them both. All right, tell you what, I'm going to jump ahead to the good news. So yes, going all the way back to the beginning, human beings have gone off course, and we've made a lot of messes of things because we've steered a course for how we think about ourselves, how we define ourselves, how we behave as human beings that's different from God's. And yet, thankfully, God intervened in human history to set things right. And specifically, of course, that happens when God himself does the most humane thing that could possibly be done, that God himself becomes a human being in Jesus Christ. So I don't know, let's see. Yeah, I'll work through this first one. Okay, so picking up where we left off in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve have decided, I can reveal myself or I can hide myself on my own terms. I don't need to let God see the truth about me. God isn't content with that. God's not going to accept that. And so we're told that the Lord actually came walking in the garden. Whatever form that might have taken, Adam and Eve were actually able to hear God walking in the garden during the cool of the day. God came to find them. It's kind of interesting that if you fast forward a few years, the very same description, in fact, the very same word is used to describe how God made his dwelling among his people in the form of the tabernacle. So that special tent that God commanded his people to make, and God said, this is the place where I'm going to be. In fact, this is the place where I will walk among you and be your God is in this tent. So I'm not just letting you go off by yourselves and define and name yourselves. Instead, I'm gonna pursue you. I'm gonna stay after you. Now, of course, the people rebelled against God in worshiping the golden calf, and in response to that, God said, okay, now you're on your own. Eventually, Moses convinced him that he would, or convinced God, held God to his promises, and God promised that he would continue to accompany them. But Moses said, okay, I want assurance though, God. I want to see your glory. And God's response to that was to say, well, no one can see me directly and live. And so instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a muted and dimmed version of my glory. And God did that by proclaiming his name to Moses. He said, the Lord, and then he talked about two different characteristics that God has, that he's compassionate and gracious, he's slow to anger and abounding in love, but he's also just, right? He does not leave the guilty unpunished. Okay, so God is staying after human beings instead of letting them go on their own. And then finally, all of this comes to fruition when the name himself, when the word becomes flesh, when the tent that God used to dwell among human beings was not made out of animal skins, but instead was made up of a real human body in Jesus Christ. And so now human beings could look directly at the face of God, just as God had created Adam and Eve to face one another. Now human beings could look at the face of God himself, and when they did, they saw that Jesus was full of grace and truth. So instead of letting us go off and just define and name ourselves, God instead comes down to earth and proclaims the name of the Lord to us, showing us that first of all, we are sinners who deserve only his punishment, but also we have been forgiven and loved by him because of his grace. Now, God also knew, so God restores human identity. Second of all, in Christ, God restores human dependence. So we've got human beings who have wandered from God, who need to be assured by God that they are forgiven, which sometimes seems to be a pretty tall order to convince human beings that God could possibly love them and forgive them. Maybe a great story that illustrates that is the story of the prodigal son. So you know the story well. The prodigal son rebels, eventually comes back. The prodigal son has got a plan for when he comes back to his father. What's the plan? What's his proposal that he wants to make? Go ahead, just blurt it out. He's going to be a servant, right? We'll get a work-reward relationship going here, right? So that's his plan. His father makes it very clear, I don't want any more servants. I've got plenty of those. Instead, I want to welcome you back as my son. So how in the world can a father convince his son who has done this thing that he's going to be welcomed back not as a servant, but instead as a son? I want you to think about that parable and recall it as well as best you can. And see if you can tell me, what did the father say to the son that finally made the difference, that made it click, that no, you're not going to be my servant, instead you're going to be my son? What were the magic words that the father said to the son to convince him, you'll be my son again? Good guess. And he said something very much like that. So it's a bit of a trick question. And even if you had the verses in front of you, it might stump you for a little bit. Because in that parable, the Father never says a single word to the Son. Instead, he speaks to the servants. And eventually he kind of speaks to all of the guests at the banquet. In other words, he announces the Son's forgiveness and the Son's welcoming back into the family, not directly to the Son, but instead in the hearing and in the public view of everyone else. And of course, not only does he say it, but he also shows it with the ring and the robe and the feast and everything that goes along with it. And so it's really a wonderful parable that illustrates just how powerful it is when a wayward sinner is assured of their forgiveness, not by themselves, not sitting on their couches with their feet up on the ottoman, but instead the added benefit that comes when there are other sinners who get to hear that. So within a Christian congregation, when there is what we might describe as one of these prodigals, right? Their sins are very public. Their sins are very open. Everyone kind of knows what their past is. And then there's someone else who, so far as everyone knows, has lived a very upstanding, moral, upright life. For that prodigal type to hear their forgiveness in the presence of the person who has seemed to be so obedient gives them wonderful extra assurance. If God is willing to tell me that I'm forgiven in front of them. And the person who maybe would be tempted to think, I know we all need forgiveness, but some of us need it more than others. For him to hear that even this prodigal is forgiven really gives them a picture of God's grace that they might not otherwise have if everyone else within the congregation was just as obedient and as devout as them. And so there really is wonderful benefit. And really, I would go so far as to say we are dependent on one another to get the full picture of God's grace, of seeing him administer that and give that out, not by ourselves, but together with our fellow believers as well. All right, let's see if we can do one more here. So in Christ, God restores human dependence. In Christ, God restores human limits. I guess I'll just finish up with this one. So you got the story of Mary and Martha. Well-known story, right? Two sisters, Jesus comes to visit. Mary's the one sitting at Jesus' feet. What's Martha up to? She's taking care of everything, right? Have you ever thought what was wrong with what Martha did? Like what made it so bad, or at least not what she should have been doing? Do you think she had no interest in Jesus' words? Do you think she tuned him out completely? Do you think she was in a completely different room where she couldn't even hear what Jesus was saying? I don't know for sure, but I like to picture it kind of the way our houses are set up, right? Where if someone's sitting down on one of the couches and someone else is in the kitchen, we're all kind of still in the same place together, right? And so maybe Martha was trying to pay attention as well as she could. But she was also trying to get done everything that she could get done. So what would we say in our world today she was doing? She was multitasking, right? In our world, we might actually view that as a virtue, a wonderful thing. Look, she's hearing the word of God, and she's also doing the things that need to get done, right? So she's doing both. She's extending herself as far as she can. Notice what Jesus says when he actually answers Martha's rebuke. So Martha goes to him and wants Jesus to kind of scold Mary. Jesus says, Mary has chosen what is better. Now, a little bit more literal translation there would be, Mary has chosen the better portion. Or we might even say, Mary has chosen the better slice of the pie. In other words, as human beings, we are not dealing with an unlimited or infinite capability of the things that we can get done. Instead, it is very much a closed circle. And every yes we say to one thing is a no that we say to something else. And Jesus was teaching Martha that to hear the word of God doesn't mean you can do that and then also keep doing everything else that you want to be doing. But instead, you need to view this as a slice of the pie. And you need to view it as something that is also causing you to say no to other things. In other words, accept your limits. Know that the work can stop for a second, because know that one piece of the pie is the most important thing of all, right? So Jesus comes and teaches us to be okay with and to accept the limits that he's given us. And if I had a little bit more time, I'd talk about how even while accepting those limits, in Christ, God also came to restore human rest and to teach us to trust that rest doesn't come when we've successfully completed all the work that needs to be done. Instead, rest comes when we say, I'll accept my limits, I'll do everything that I can, and then I'll stop when I need to stop, and I'll trust that God can work through the rest of these human beings, and God can work in other ways too, and he'll take care of everything that needs to be taken care of. Instead of me trying to be infinite and limitless, I'll trust that God is, and I'll live within my limits and graciously accept his rest. All right, well, that 55 minutes went much quicker than I thought it was going to, but hopefully it wasn't too much of a fire hose. Is there a little bit of time for maybe a question or two?
We've never had this before where a guy ran out of time teaching here.
That's never happened before?
Yeah, well.
I often explain, there is this latent fear deep inside of every pastor's mind that they will run out of stuff to say. And so you just overcompensate that by creating double the amount that can actually be said.
We can take a question.
A question.
Yeah, a question. Baby two. Anyone?
What's your 1 minute explanation of your internet?
Oh, don't blame the paddles. Okay, so one kind of interesting thing, you could hop on a tube way up in Hibbing, Minnesota, and go down that's not where the headwaters of the Mississippi start, but if you got on a tube on the Mississippi River, it would carry you about 26 miles a day, which is the length of a marathon, right? That's a substantial distance. If you close your eyes, you might not even realize that you're moving because it would just feel like this slow, gradual thing. And so the currents of these streams might take us great distances without us even realizing it. Now, we have paddles, and in this case, the paddles are the technology. So we can actually add to the speed with some of the advances in technology that can get us down the stream even farther and even faster. It is tempting to look at the ways that technology is getting used and to think, well, that's the problem. And I certainly don't want to give the impression with anything that I've said that the technology is the problem. The problem instead is that we're going down the wrong stream, and then we're using the technology to make us go faster. And so the question is not so much what is this thing capable of, but what have we as human beings chosen to do with this thing? So just as one quick example, anyone remember the year that the iPhone came out? The first original iPhone, Steve Jobs going up there on stage and giving this mind-blowing piece of news that this one device would be able to do all these things. It was 2006, okay? If you look back at that original iPhone, for the most part, the technology that we have with our, I don't know if anybody has a 16, is that what we're up to these days? The technology hasn't changed that much. The basics of the iPhone are still the basics of the iPhone. But in 2006, the only thing that was on your iPhone were the apps that Apple put on there. The Apple App Store, where developers could create apps, didn't come along until 2008, which kind of opened up the whole world for anybody to put on an iPhone anything that they wanted. That, of course, included things like social media. It wasn't until 2009 that social media platforms like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter got things like the like button or the retweet button that really created the world we think of when we think of our phones. So if you think of 2006, I don't think even Steve Jobs would have envisioned teenagers sitting there staring at their phones instead of interacting with each other, teenagers being plagued by all of the things that happen with teenagers as a result of the use of social media. And so the question is not, well, is the problem with the technology, but what do we use the technology to do? We're using this wonderful technology to isolate each other from ourselves. We're using this technology to think that we can be self-defining and self-naming creatures, which is in large part what social media is all about. So the problem is not with what the thing does, but what we as human beings are using it to do. And once we're on that inhumane stream, we can use the technology as a paddle that helps us go even faster. So
let's thank Pastor Bauer for that, all of that. Thinking I see a repeat invitation next year if you're willing, Pastor Bauer.
To give the other half of
the other half of your presentation, yeah.